Well, welcome everybody. Lovely to see so many of you here and our friends who are also online. I'm Richard Layard. I'm the co-director of the Wellbeing Research Programme in our Centre for Economic Performance here. And like my colleagues here, I was a good friend and loved Daniel Kahneman. And so it's wonderful to have the chance of celebrating his life. So I'm going to go first, if only because I was born the same year and the same month as he was. Remarkable coincidence, I found. Then we'll have Gillian Tett. Gillian is the Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and a great writer in the Financial Times, as I'm sure you know. And then we'll have Paul Dolan, who's Professor of Behavioural Sciences in the school and created the department of that subject. And after that, we want to have questions and comments from all of you and online. And then we're going to have a finale. The finale will be from Barbara Tversky, who is a very important person in most of Danny's life, and I'll explain a bit more about that. But Barbara, wave your hands, Barbara. I say Barbara will round this off. Okay, well, I think the thing which we all would agree on is that Danny was one of the most remarkable and significant people that we will ever know in our lives. So it's not surprising that in 2002 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, the first time it had ever been awarded to a full-blown psychologist. And the prize was for what Danny and Barbara's husband, Amos Tversky, had done, because they had exploded the idea that people are rational and consistent in the choices that they make. Instead, as Danny and Amos showed, people use rough and ready heuristics. They depend hugely on how a choice is framed. They judge many outcomes relative to the status quo, and so on. So that was the basis of behavioural economics. They were the founders of behavioural economics. And Gillian and Paul will be talking a lot about that. I want to talk about the implications of Danny's work for public policy, which is my special interest. Because obviously the findings that people are not rational and consistent blows a huge hole in standard welfare economics and standard cost-benefit analysis used for making policy decisions. Because if people are irrational, you can't any longer estimate the social value of anything by what people are willing to pay for it, which is the central message and method in cost-benefit analysis. So how can we find out the value of anything? That's a fundamental question for policymakers. They have to have some method of valuing what they do in order to choose between priorities. So Danny's answer was a very simple one. He said, find out how a policy affects people's well-being. Pretty obvious answer. So in other words, measure the effects of a policy through a direct measurement, for example, in an experiment or trial, of how it affects people's well-being, and then judge the policy by the outcome in terms of people's measured well-being. So Danny called this back to Bentham. That's what it was. I had been a student at Gillian's College where I read Jeremy Bentham, and I thought this was terrific when I heard this message coming from Danny in the late 1990s. And when Danny came and gave the Robbins lectures here, which he did in 1998, it changed my life. I changed everything that I worked on, because Danny had persuaded me that we could indeed measure well-being. So what had happened was that the great psychologist Ed Diener had started measuring subjective well-being in the 1980s, and Danny seized on that work and built on it, and of course made it much more widely known, particularly after he got the Nobel Prize in 2002, he made the whole idea of measuring well-being respectable. So that was when we started our well-being program here in the Centre for Economic Performance. We had constant help from Danny. I can remember still at least 10 times when he came over. Often he brought some of his colleagues, and he was a terrific person for assembling colleagues in a collective effort. And of course, we also went over to Princeton. Paul and I went many times. With Danny's help, we managed to persuade the British government in 2011 to measure the nation's well-being as a, quote, official statistic. And that included at least 2 questions that had been designed by Danny. Shortly after that, the OECD recommended its members to use the same questions. And I think all the members do, except for the United States, now do that. Meantime, there was another thing Danny was doing, which was working on the Gallup World Poll, which is an amazing thing, covering every country in the world, 1,000 people every year, persuading them to measure happiness and life satisfaction in every country, so that we now have a complete picture of what life is like in the world. I think it's the best picture that we have of life on Earth for humans, and it comes out every year in the World Happiness Report. But of course, the ultimate point of measuring well-being is to change it and to make it the target for public policy. So I think the world is moving in that direction. I wouldn't say it's fast, but it's moving and it's accelerating. So in 2019, the EU invited its members to put well-being at the centre of policy design. I wouldn't say it's had a big effect. OECD said something similar. But actually, our country has made more progress in this direction than any other, and I think it's about to make more progress in the coming year. So the story, just to blow a trumpet for our centre, my colleagues Paul Freitas and Chris Krekel published a handbook on wellbeing policy making. Shortly after that, the Treasury revised its Green Book, which is its manual for policy appraisal, to encourage the use of direct measures of well-being. And that's going to be the basis of the first spending review that's been done since that, which is coming up, as you probably know, in the earlier part of next year. And if that goes reasonably well, we will be the first country to evaluate policy in terms of its effects on well-being, the well-being of the citizens. And this is a simple product of Danny. It would never have happened without Danny and the prestige which he gave to this whole line of work. And things are moving ahead abroad also. I've just come back from Rome, where the OECD has held its first big conference on well-being. So I think it's obvious that Danny's influence after his life is going to be a lot bigger than his influence in his life. It can only grow and grow. I have to admit that Danny and I didn't always agree about everything, including how well-being should be measured. So one issue was about the preference I have for simple questions like how satisfied are you with your life? In 2004, Danny, with Alan Kruger and other colleagues, made a big pitch for the idea that the main measurement should be of misery and not of well-being across the whole spectrum. So he had developed, which has gone now from strength to strength, the measurement of well-being in real time, or not quite real time to start with. It was reconstructing the previous day in the so-called day reconstruction method, or DRM, which had recorded hour by hour what you had been doing and how you felt. And Danny thought as I was saying, that the main role of the state should be to prevent misery, and he wanted, therefore, to use the DRM evidence to construct for each individual a misery index, measuring how much of the day each person was miserable, and then use that as the target for government policy. But of course, we economists had to point out to him the state also has to look after everybody else in the society. It's got a major role in supporting the good life for everybody. And I think Danny eventually came round to that view. At first, he still wanted to have the measure, a hedonic measure of how you felt moment by moment, like how happy were you yesterday, that kind of question, rather than what you might call an evaluative measure, like how satisfied are you with your life nowadays. But eventually, he made a compromise on this too, and he came to the view that because memory is so important in people's lives, he was inclined to think that life satisfaction actually was all right after all. So Danny was not just a great thinker and scholar, he was also a wonderful person. He was just marvellous to be with. He was so clever, but he was also so charming, and as I experienced him, so sweet-natured. And you couldn't help loving him. He was that kind of person. He was also surely the most influential person that I've ever known, and as I said, I think his influence can only grow as time passes. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a wonderful honour and privilege to be here today with friends and with so many esteemed people in the audience to talk about a man who I revered, not simply for his astonishing intellect and the mark he left on the world of academia, and not just because I regard him as the human equivalent of a sower. And by that I mean he was somebody who went around and sowed intellectual seeds in so many people and so many areas without knowing what the harvest would be in the future, but somehow knowing that he was planting ideas in people. And I think we're going to be living with that harvest in all kinds of different fields. And the fact we come from different fields is quite important. We're going to be reaping the harvest of his ideas for many, many, many years to come. But the other thing I loved about Danny Kahneman was just what a lovely, kind person he was. And you're going to hear that over and over again, because he was not just incredibly kind and very generous with his time to colleagues and academics and brilliantly important people and all the financiers who used to queue up and spend a lot of money trying to get hold of him. I'll never forget him coming over for dinner with Barbara in New York one time. It was summer, and at the table was my then deeply annoying teenage daughter. And she asked, as teenagers do, lots of questions, which I kind of slightly winced at. And he was just extraordinary in not just listening properly in a way that made me feel like a terrible mother, but actually engaging and providing proper answers. And he planted a seed in her that I know is going to bear a harvest, because he basically made her decide that she wanted to study psychology. So one point about this is, if you are struggling as a parent of teenagers, try bringing over a world-famous academic to inspire them and to at least stop them yelling at you over the dinner table for one night. But more seriously, there are three things about Danny Kahneman's legacy that I think we should think about today that matter enormously for the world that we're living in at the moment. The first is what he did in forcing the financial world, the policy-making world, the journalist world, and the academic world of economics to rethink their obsession with models. That's an issue of particular relevance to me because, as some of you may know, I'm Provost of King's College, Cambridge today. I spent the last 30 years working full-time as a journalist at the Financial Times, but before that I did a PhD in cultural anthropology. And I don't know if are there any anthropologists in the audience? Oh, there are a few, great. We're not totally outnumbered by economists or psychologists, but when I was an anthropologist, we were kind of trained to think that economists were basically very, very flawed as a discipline because they were obsessed with models and this idea that human beings are rational. And anthropologists were often very scornful of classic traditional macroeconomics. I think it's partly because we were jealous that they had so much more money and resources in the department than anthropologists did. But there was a real sense that economists were kind of very limited in how they looked at the world. And when I joined the Financial Times after doing a PhD in cultural anthropology, that sense was reinforced considerably. And economists, using their wonderful models and their visions of rational man, seemed to totally rule the roost in every sense. I used to keep very quiet about the fact I was an anthropologist because that was pretty scorned. And then, of course, along came the crisis of 2008, and suddenly it became very clear that rational man was not so rational at all in the middle of a financial crisis. And there was a call to try and rethink economics. Groups like the Institute for New Economic Thinking were created. You can see Anatol here tonight, one of the people who was involved in creating that. But the reality is that insofar as economics got a reprieve after 2008, Daniel Kahneman was responsible for a lot of that, because he had been building the field of behavioural economics for many, many years, and suddenly, post-2008, it became fantastically relevant and important. Not only were macroeconomists forced to rethink some of their approaches, and even groups like the CFA, which had hitherto been almost entirely model-based and numbers-based in its approach to life, and wedded to the idea of rational man and the occasional woman, not only were economists and financiers forced to rethink their approach, but I would argue more widely that there became something of a recognition that it was a good idea to blend social science and economic science in every sense. I kind of had a dream at the time that just as the financial world was waking up and realizing that it paid to look at individual psychological biases, in the future they would also all en masse wake up and realize it pays to look at cultural biases, otherwise known as anthropology, group cultural biases. But sadly that hasn't quite happened yet, which is partly, I must be honest, the fault of the anthropologists as much as the economists and the financiers. But what Daniel Kahneman did was make it clear that it pays to recognize that yes, models can be useful, but they're limited because people are not rational, their actions are distorted, and that really matters. And that simple point, I would argue, is becoming even more relevant today than it was before. Second legacy of Daniel Kahneman, which I think is also becoming more relevant, is not just the attitude of models and man, but also the question of how man relates to machine, otherwise known as robots and AI. And this is an area of his life that he was really only starting to properly explore, I'd argue. His book Noise, which is less known than the earlier books, or rather than Thinking Fast and Slow, has some fascinating work there about the use of big data and how that relates or doesn't relate to human beings. And the key point is that we live in an age where it's very easy to feel quite morally superior in terms of the human brain and feel we have to protect human decision-making and brains at all costs vis-a-vis artificial intelligence and robots, until you take on board that simple point that humans' brains are flawed, or more accurately, they are basically distorted by all of the psychological biases that he wrote about. And he had a rather different attitude about whether it's better to rely on human brains or AI programs or big data in critical moments of policy making and decisions. And it's not necessarily either or, it's and checks and balances, and a combination of approaches that could be useful. And I think, although tragically he's not around to really talk about this now, given that we're living in the era of ChatGPT, when suddenly AI is so dominant, I think his approach is actually very important. I sometimes say that what artificial intelligence needs is anthropology intelligence, one AI plus another AI, to create the right type of intelligence, which is augmented intelligence, the third AI. But actually, you can equally turn it around and simply say that what you need is a big dose of Daniel Kahneman's wisdom when looking at AI today to reshape the debate, potentially in a more constructive way. And the last point that Daniel Kahneman should teach us all, which I also think is incredibly relevant today, is a point about humility, curiosity, and being willing to say, I'm wrong. Because when you look back at all of the people who reminisced about his extraordinary life, one of the most remarkable themes that comes up over and over again is that notwithstanding the fact that he was a towering intellect, that as you just heard from Lord Layard, in many ways had a bigger impact on academia than almost anyone else, at least in the social sciences, he was somebody who constantly said, I am wrong. Tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me how I can learn more. Tell me how I can rethink my ideas. Tell me about a new discipline that I can learn from. And on one level, that sounds kind of obvious, because that's what the academy is supposed to be theoretically all about. But as any of you who actually work in the academy today know, we live in an academy that is utterly tribal. We have departments, silos, which are competing with each other. And the entire structure of this environment encourages us to be constantly so defensive that it's very hard for most of us to turn around and say, I am wrong. And it's even harder in public life, given the polarization, the pressures, the anger, and the expectations and the scrutiny from social media. And in many ways, in my view, that is one of the things that I wish we could all learn from his legacy. And boy, do we need it now. And the very last thing I'll say is we're going to hear later from Barbara, who is an extraordinary psychologist in her own right. As an anthropologist, I have long loved the work she's done on spatial psychology and the relationship between mind, matter, and our environment. As someone whose intellectual lodestar was Pierre Bourdieu, any of you who've done Bourdieu will know about the importance of our surroundings and how they shape how we look at the world and vice versa. You might also know about the work of people looking at the concept of embodiment, embodied culture, all of which I find fascinating when she talks about her work. So we'll be hearing from her later. But I just want to say, last of all, I'm really sad that Daniel Kahneman can't be here with us today, because I know he'd love learning, finding out where he's wrong, finding ways to try and bring together psychology, behavioural science with economics, AI, and much more beyond. And we really need it now more than ever. Thank you.
Shall I just go straight out?
What yours is what you do.
So, fantastic. I didn't know you were going to say that at the end, I have to say. There's a couple of things that... I know, no, well, that's, totally changed everything. I have a couple of reflections on thinking about this evening. First of all, what a great honour it is. Okay, so maybe three things. First of all, what a great honour it is. Secondly, we're talking about the legacy of a man who didn't really care much for legacy, which I think is a certain irony. but of course we'll have a significant one. And third of all, it feels a bit like a best man speech, but without the groom present, where you can kind of say a lot of things that are in-jokes and just things that only a handful of people will laugh at or understand. And I'm hoping that I don't do that. And what I'm going to do is try to pick on a couple of things that personally impacted on me that will hopefully have a greater impact on other people and will resonate with the audience more widely. And I'm going to frame it around things Danny and I disagreed about, because we argued a lot and he liked having a good argument. I think that was a great thing that you said, Gillian, there. And I think, and I will end with a few more words about disagreement. But the first thing to say about disagreement, or at least where we might have departed company a little bit, was when he was doing the work on the day reconstruction method, which many of you will be familiar with, the paper in Science, I think, about 20 years ago. That was around the time that we met, and I thought there were a couple of things that were obvious but overlooked in that work. And the first of which related to purpose. Danny had spent a lot of time in that work talking about pleasure and the role of affect in our experiences, and it got me thinking about the role of purpose in our experience as well, and informed a lot of my work subsequently, including Happiness by Design, which he wrote the foreword for. I never was sure that he was fully convinced by the role of experiences of purpose, but I'll try to convince him if he was here again. And the second thing was about, and this is where we did often have many arguments, about the role of the where our attention goes when we're not paying attention to our experiences, to the mind wanderings that we have, and the significance of those, and the roles of anticipation and memory in our experiences. The things that we think about when we're not paying attention to the people that we're with or the things that we're doing. Like many of you now, your mind is wandering off all over the place, thinking about many more exciting things than anything that I have to say in the next few minutes. And I was committed, in a way that Danny wasn't in the end, to pursuing a research agenda and a policy one that more directly captured people's experiences as they went about their lives, and not to have recourse to life satisfaction measures necessarily, although they do add value, and to be able to better capture the flow of our experiences, which includes the ways in which our minds go off into many other places, including looking forward to stuff, and including reminiscing on stuff. We're here talking about the impact that Danny will have into the future of all of the work that he did necessarily now in the past. So I want to come back, though. I always make notes and then I don't bother using them or reading them. It's always a complete waste of time to do that. But it's much easier. I don't know how you do it, to actually talk to notes, which is a really important skill that I've never learned in 30 years as an academic. But I want to talk about the role of adversarial collaboration, which is something that Danny... the most amazing, one of the many things that were amazing about him was his continued interest in new things. And for those of you that haven't seen the talk that he gave on adversarial collaboration, you can find it online, it's very easy, in November 2023, so recently. And he, as, I don't know if, for those that may not be familiar with the term, it basically is what it says on the tin. You bring together people who explicitly disagree. They agree the research methods, and then hopefully agree on the conclusions that come out of the research, such that they might even change their minds. And I think, in my experiences over the last few years, and really speaking to what you just said, Gillian, about the nature of tribes in the academy, I think that's a much more honest approach to doing academic research than to pretend that we can somehow be dispassionate, objective academics and scientists. We really can't. All of us carry around a set of priors, a set of beliefs about how the world ought to be, let alone how it is, that we can't not help but take into our research. So I think it's much better to be honest and flush those out, be explicit about them, to then go into the research question. And Danny was a great advocate of doing that. But interestingly, though, of course, Danny being the natural pessimist he was pretty much about most things, although maybe he wasn't that pessimistic, because He was pessimistic in one sense, that people don't change their minds. People don't change their minds about any things that matter to us. We obviously change our minds about many things, but none of us really change our minds about anything that matters to us. And what we're very good at doing, even in adversarial collaboration, is having hindsight wisdom. So the moment that you get the results that come through that surprise you, you have a moment of surprise. And then you're very clever at being able to explain away the findings because there was something flawed in the methods or something wrong in the data analysis or something wrong in the study. We're very, very, very good. And we don't predict that. We think we will change our minds. We openly and honestly go into an adversarial collaboration thinking that we will change our minds. But actually, we're then very good at being able to go through the mental gymnastics that explain away reasons why we should change our mind. So you might think that then that makes it a worthless activity. This is where Danny and I fundamentally agree with one another. It's a lot better than the alternative. Because what does the alternative look like in academia? It looks like angry science, as he called it. It basically looks like people writing comments, replies, rejoinders, principally to score points, to score academic points off each other, and always focusing on the weakest link of an argument, always focusing on the weakest aspects of what an alternative theory, for example, has to offer. Never on the strongest points, because you don't pick on the strongest bits, do you? I mean, that'd be silly. You pick on the weakest bits, and you pick on the weakest bits as if it then undermines the whole theory or the whole model. And Danny saw that as not particularly helpful, and undermining what really we should be in academia is humble, which is the great thing that Danny had, humility. What adversarial collaboration does is it basically tells you that you're all fucking wrong. Like, everybody gets it wrong. None of us really know what we're doing, really. We're all muddling our way through. We're all learning as we go. And adversarial collaboration gives us the humility to understand that. And I think that's the great advance of bringing together people that explicitly disagree with one another. And as I say, we spent 20 years or more disagreeing pretty much most of the time when we met, but with a view to resolution through some scientific method or otherwise. So the other thing I just want to conclude with saying about Danny is, alongside humility, he had great wisdom. And one of the things that he was very wise to suggest to me during the pandemic was that he asked me once how I was getting on with getting the fair innings argument, the idea that we should be giving greater priority to people who have had less of a fair innings rather than more of one. It's an ethical viewpoint that I've held for a very long time that he also shared. And he said, how are you getting on with the fair innings argument? I said, no one's listening, Danny. He said, I'd go and do something more useful instead, like get drunk or something. He said, because now's not the time to try to get people to listen to that. But on that point of a fair innings, I know for sure that Danny, it is sad that he's not here with us. And he would obviously have much to say to what we've all said and what you will add. But he felt he had a very good innings. And I think that's a great cause for celebration, not only for the 90 years that he had and all of the impact that he had during that time, but all of the fantastic impact he will have subsequently. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much to Gillian and Paul. Now we've got time for questions and comments.
Questions before me. You want questions first?
I thought we would do that.
That's fine.
No, it's up to you, Barbara. No, if you feel moved to do it now, do it.
People
Come
might
on.
have questions for her as well, so
Pardon me?
people might have questions for you as well, perhaps.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Barbara, please.
Yeah. I think you're the star of the show.
But I need to explain who Barbara is. So Barbara was married to Amos Tversky, with whom Danny did his most important work. Sadly, she was sadly, she was then widowed. And after many years, Danny also was widowed. And then this lovely union occurred in the last 5 years of these two people living together and loving each other. And this is a wonderful story.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really a privilege to know both of them, and in many ways. So I first met Danny when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, a beginning graduate student, and he came for a postdoc. I was already with Amos, and he was about to go to Harvard to spend a postdoc year to wait for me to make a little more progress on my own degree. And Danny came, and we met him and spent many hours and days with him before Amos left. He was at that point not the way that he's known here. He was wiry and wired. So he was very up and down, dynamic, ideas torn this way, that way. It's sort of no wonder that he got into attention. And in fact, that year, he was working across the hall from me on his pupil work. And if every time he needed a pilot subject, he came and got me. It was a guaranteed headache. You had a board here, something in your mouth, so your head was stable and you were watching numbers come. You had to remember them and then recall them. So, but he was so charming, you couldn't say, you went. So later, we were all several years later, all in Jerusalem together, and he and Amos began working together. And as my first child said, when he was a year and a third old, he asked, "Where's his father? Where's Daddy?" And I said, "Daddy's working." And he said, "Daddy talking Danny." That was their work. They spent hours together in the same place, talking and laughing in 2 languages and having the time of their lives. So in every few minutes or every few hours, they would come out of the room with a new idea, eager to tell me, or eager to ask me one of their questions. So I again got used to answering all the variability of the questions, and our kids grew up in that. So it was really a privilege to have a front row seat to the way they worked, to those 2 amazing human beings, and to the work that developed. So it's hard to say anything about Danny that he didn't say about himself. You can find him everywhere on YouTube. He's uninhibited about talking and is always interesting to hear. I've heard many of his talks many times. He was born a psychologist. He was a psychologist by genetics and by inclination, and certainly by upbringing. As he said, his mother was a gossip. He would spend a lot of time with his mother. His father died early on. And she was a gossip, but an interesting one. And she and her friends constantly dissected people, everyone they knew, dissected. Why did they do what they do? Why didn't they do something else? Looking for the motives. It was never about money. It was about character meeting a situation. And that certainly, that kind of thinking, I think, affected Danny all his life. And as you know and can see, psychologists think about well-being and about money very different from economists. These economists are exceptions, all of them, and welcome exceptions. So Danny entered psychology at just the right time. The field was breaking the shackles of behaviorism. You could peer into the mind, and you could use your intuitions about human behavior to come up with hypotheses and then test them. So both things were there. You could use your intuitions, but you had to show that you were right empirically, and often you were wrong. And Danny was never at a loss for intuitions. He had hundreds of ideas a day. Not all of them were good, but many of them were golden and brought to good research. Early on, having ideas in every which way on every field in psychology was a bit of a disadvantage. He went into perception, personality, language, attention, clinical. He spent a summer in an institution for people who were having problems and very involved in that. So he went every which way. When he and Amos started working together, that focused him. I mean, Danny said many times that Amos really focused him, channeled him. They began working, as most of you know, on judgments, on how judgments go wrong, what are the heuristics we use to make judgments, because we don't have anything in our brains that assess probabilities objectively, so we have to rely on something else. Then they turned to decision-making and weighing probabilities and utilities, subjective values, whatever. And their most cited paper, in fact, was the one that later won Danny a Nobel Prize, the paper on prospect theory. And there are kind of two lessons there. You start with a reference point, and losses loom larger than gains. And these are powerful tools to predict behavior. They have been amended many times. Not long after they developed and published prospect theory, Danny struck off on his own, breaking other shackles. And one of the things he did was chase the values side of the equation, which eventually brought him to well-being and happiness. And even though he worked on biases, Danny was never immune from them. He had a lot of his own biases. And in fact, because he wasn't immune to them, he often could recognize them, recognize that they were universal, whatever, or widespread, and examine them, and then use them again for fodder for experiments and theories. One of his more endearing biases was to glorify the people around him. He once praised to the sky one of his research assistants as being absolutely brilliant when he worked for me. And I never knew, was it Danny that made him brilliant and it was my fault? Or what? But he did glorify the people around him, and that made them happy. And when they were happy, he was happy. So this is a kind of an automatic, whoops, I've got the wrong. My cell phone did something crazy. So he took joy from the joys of the people around him. He loved hearing joyous stories. He loved hearing what you did that was wonderful. He turned me into a braggart, which would have horrified my mother. And it was reluctant to me, but he really loved hearing other people's pleasures, joys, and so forth. And you tried to make Danny happy. And you could by telling him good things. And then you were happier. So it was a virtuous cycle that somehow I wish the whole world knew. Right. So and he actually loved children. I mean, he really enjoyed interacting with children. My 8 grandchildren were fortunate to enjoy conversations with him, and he was truly interested in what each of them were doing and thinking. You know, and I'm the grandmother. I think they're pretty neat kids, but I know that other people don't always. So I appreciated that. So a couple of stories now, more stories. this intuitive wisdom about making people happy wasn't just reflective in Danny, it was reflexive. Years ago, one of the legendary tech bros, I won't name him, asked Danny how he, the tech bro, could get someone to engineer him to be happier. Okay? So Danny was appalled, and he had noticed earlier in the evening tension between that tech bro and his wife. And what he thought, I don't think he said it at the time, but he certainly thought, you can't be happier than your wife. Make your wife happy. So, another bit of wisdom, several years prior to that, Danny and his family were living in Berkeley, and he had married Ann Treisman. Ann Treisman had 4 children, amazing kids, all their letters, photographs, and the children wrote letters to their grandmother every week. They were writers, so all the writing, everything in the house went up in flames. And so it was devastating, all the family history. And his solution was to upgrade. They got a generous settlement from the insurance, so they went higher in the Berkeley Hills. And now instead of having a 2-bridge view, they had a 3-bridge view. So that, I mean, when you have big losses, make the gains even better, if you can. So that was, again, a bit of life wisdom that he had. Now, another story that some of you will know, at a meeting on well-being at Oxford a little more than 2 years ago, Danny talked, and he was asked a lot of questions, and at some point he said, I want to answer a question you haven't asked me. What was my most important or my greatest contribution to the study of well-being? And he said it was getting Richard Layard interested in the topic. So as Gillian pointed out, as Paul pointed out, as Richard pointed out, Danny's legacy goes beyond that. He left many communities with stuff to work on. Attention, judgment, choice, rationality, fairness, well-being, the very conduct of research, the adversarial collaborations, the replication crisis that Paul referred to, and AI. AI became very excited about the idea that there's thinking fast and thinking slow. And many of them felt, because they're using networks, neural networks, that they're working on the fast problem and that they need to work on the slow one. And many of them have set that as their ideal of trying to add some sort of reasoning into the AI program. So he had a big influence on AI. His modesty and humility that has been spoken about wasn't a veneer. It really ran deep within him. And as Gillian pointed out, he knew he could be wrong. And he always said he liked changing his mind. But don't try to change it. He has to change it. When I tried to change his mind, when Emma's tried to change his mind, he resisted, as he should, right? There was a reason he'd come to the conclusions, and he wanted to make sure that we knew the reasons before we disagreed. So he knew there were, on the modesty again, he knew there were people smarter and wiser than he. He knew that from a young age. And he knew that he had been extremely lucky in life. And that part of his luck, a great deal of his luck, were his friends, who were his collaborators in many cases, and his collaborators who became his friends, and you've just heard from them. So we benefit not just from Danny's work, but also from his example. So thank you.
Barbara.
Barbara, I think you're the one they want to hear from, so you should definitely be up here.
That was really lovely, Barbara. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank all of you.
You talked about him and children. I think if you want to know something about Danny, one way you can find it is by listening to Desert Island Discs. He did a wonderful Desert Island disc, and the last item was a wonderful Bach piece played by his grandson.
Yeah.
That was the one he was going to take to the island. I thought that was really lovely. So now, time for questions. If you are online, use the Q&A function at the top left-hand corner of your screen. Martin will assemble some of those questions. But let's start off with questions from here. Yeah, at the back now. Tell us who you are, and then make the question snappy.
Hello. Do consumers only act on impulse?
What was the question?
Do consumers only act on impulse? Do consumers only act on impulse?
Okay,
President,
that's
do you want to
for the
comment?
economist.
Well, last time I checked, I think I'm an anthropologist, not an economist. But anyway.
We'll do them one by one. Do you want to
Okay. Well, I think one of the key points about Daniel Kahneman's work was that, you know, in the late 20th century, there was this idea that human beings were rational creatures that had access to perfect information and made considered, consistent decisions independent from each other. And these days, we know, to use a scientific term, that that's total bollocks. And in fact, people are very influenced by peer groups, by all kinds of, nudges and things like that. So I think the answer is, do consumers only act on impulse? The answer is absolutely not. Many times consumers will plan and think pretty seriously and hard, and occasionally people do act a little bit like rational man and woman, but not all the time. And I say the power of his work was to recognise the degree to which biases and heuristics shape us and mean that we do sometimes seem to be acting on impulse in a way that's actually got a bigger pattern to it.
Gillian made a good point. Different people buy or do anything for different reasons at different times. So this makes social science research difficult and nudges difficult because they're not going to work on everybody all the time.
I'd love to know from Barbara, what did Danny Kahneman do when he went shopping? Come a bit closer so they can hear.
I think another thing that enters there is habit. What do you need and what do you buy?
Next.
You can use ratings. I don't really know. So, yeah. We'll go on to another question.
Yeah, Bernard Casey, ex of LSE and other places. I was interested in the discussion that we had earlier about adversarial collaboration. A few days ago, we were listening to a discussion about Hayek and his 50th Nobel Prize anniversary. And a lot of the discussion there was about what he called the Chicago Seminar, where he was bringing together, it seemed to be, people in precisely that kind of context. I wondered whether anybody could comment upon how Kahneman might have reacted to Hayek and the kinds of things that he was talking about. Thank you.
There might be other people better placed. I never spoke to Danny about Hayek. Spoke about many things. I think Danny would have taken the view, as we've said all along, that he was probably quite a little bit right, but quite a lot wrong. I mean, I think that's pretty much true of anybody. Name any individual, they're going to be quite a bit right and quite a lot wrong. And the key thing is to bring together, again, to restate the point, since you drew attention to the term again, to bring together people who are all a little bit right, a lot wrong, and to not fall into the trap that we just all naturally do. And anyone who's had children, they would know that one of the first things kids will say, is this a good person? Is this a bad person? Is this right? Is this wrong? We fall very much and quickly into the polarities, into the dualism of things being all right or all wrong, all good or all evil. And any sensible person, Danny particularly, knew the world is full of ambivalence.
I mean, we tend to get published today in public life for changing our minds, or academic life. And that is just crazy, because we live in a world that's changing fast, and where, frankly, none of us have a monopoly on the truth. When I was running the newsroom in America for the Financial Times, I used to say constantly to people, on a really good day, we get 30% of the truth. I think our competitors get 20%. But, we should never fool ourselves that we actually have all the picture and all the truth, because none of us do. And I think that was one of his strengths, was his ability to say that, he would change his mind.
Here, in the white shirt.
Thank you. I'm Steve Baker. I'm an infamous former MP, but I'm also a former aerospace and software engineer. I want to say thank you for the privilege of hearing such powerful remarks. But the thing I thought I heard from you all was a recurring theme that we're not very good at applying what we know in the social sciences. What we know to be true in the social sciences, we're not very good at bringing to bear. So things like modelling and better disagreements, even in the academy, people you've told us are not very good at agreeing to disagree gracefully. So as an engineer who's constantly trying to take ideas and apply them so we can go flying in aeroplanes or build software systems or whatever, is it true that we're not very good at applying what we know to be true in the social sciences? And if so, why?
Is it true?
That we're not very good at using the insights of social sciences.
I'll give a first reaction. I think that there is just a huge gap between the policymakers and the generators of social science, which is just not efficiently bridged. Now, who's to blame? I've asked various policymakers, if you're bothered about an issue, it's the first question you ask of your assistants, who knows most about this? And they almost all say, no, I don't. I ask them who they think knows most about this, but I don't ask them to find it out. I ask them, you deal with this. And so the way that knowledge percolates up to the level of decision makers is through a whole series of intermediaries who are often not necessarily very bright, or may also be biased. But I think to overcome this gap is actually an absolutely major challenge to any society. I honestly don't know what the most obvious things to do, but I think that, if I'm talking about politicians, but even senior civil servants, I think they should be exposed to systematic instruction. I think MPs should be given courses in social science when they start, and I think there should just be more humility amongst adults as to what they know, and more systematic teaching, rather than some academic having to say something very catchy in order to get heard, even though that's not their comparative advantage. Their comparative advantage is to discover the truth. There should be better systems.
I think Barbara was going to say something.
No, I think you've said it. Thank you.
Okay, next
Paul
one.
has.
No,
Anatole.
let's get more questions. It's good to get more comments.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anatole Kletsky. I'm an economist and do other things. I've got two questions, sort of linguistic or methodological. First of all, you all used the word rationality and how people are irrational. But I wonder whether that's really an accurate word or a misleading one, and I wonder how Kahneman felt about that. Because when economists talk about rationality, they're actually just talking about consistency or financial materialism in some ways. And did he think, there's nothing irrational about being heuristic or being inconsistent in certain circumstances. So is it appropriate to use this word rationality, or is it perhaps something that constantly, biases people against recognizing the sort of issues that you've raised? And the second question is about adversarial collaboration. Is this just the same as the dialectical method that goes, all the way back to Socrates?
I think we all want to answer those important questions. I will say something about rationality. So let's take the simple example. So there are these 4 companies that have a pension scheme. And initially, you have to opt into the scheme. And then they change, and they have it so that you have to opt out of the scheme. The first time, where you just have to, you literally have to put a tick. That's all you have to do, you have to put a tick. For opting in, it's about 40% who opt in. If you have to opt out, it's about 80% who opt in. Now, that doesn't suggest a consistent approach to what is, after all, a rather important decision.
So if I can comment on that, Amos especially, but also Danny, were careful not to use the word rationality. Other people used it. But if you pushed Amos to the wall, he would say, it means I regret my decision. So it's consistency, yes, is part of it, but it's also making a decision that you later see a fault in. And that was one way of approaching rationality, but they deliberately avoided the term, especially Amos. So on adversarial collaboration, the idea was for adversaries to come together and design a critical experiment that distinguished the 2 theories, and to both agree in writing ahead of time that they would, whatever the results of the experiment was, they would abide by them. So I think it's different from the dialectic, and it was partly to prevent that. I mean, what happened in many cases, as Danny said, is when the results come, you get 15 more IQ points because you suddenly see why if it goes against your theory, why your theory wouldn't have predicted that anyway. So it becomes an interesting issue. He did have his first adversarial collaboration with his wife, Anne Treisman, over attention, and they never agreed, but the marriage stayed. So, and another one that he was especially fond of was with Gary Klein, who believed in expertise and actually trashed heuristics and biases. He believed in expertise and having good intuitions about things. And they came together and they eventually agreed expertise works when you have feedback. So you're not just working on your intuitions, you get feedback from your predictions. And Danny's example had always been interviews for job situations, and people got more and more confident about their interviews, but they had no check on whether their predictions held out, so they got more confident without getting more reliable. So if you have feedback, then it will work. So it did work out. They fine-tuned the concepts and came up with an agreement and a deep friendship.
Just quickly on the rationality point, I don't think I said it. because I avoid using it for exactly the reasons that you outlined. In the paper that Danny and I collaborated on, we used the term substantive rationality to be clear that it's in the experiences of the consequences of your decisions. And that's what led some of us into happiness research away from using hypothetical preferences to inform policy decisions.
Lots of hands. There are lots of hands up there.
Hi, Martin Sandberg. I'm a journalist with the Financial Times, still colleague of Gillian's.
We'll accumulate 2 or 3 now, and then we'll come to the online. Yeah.
I'm also a long since lapsed academic, and I drew on some of Daniel Kahneman's ideas in my PhD. And I want to get back to this idea of how much he changed other fields, and in particular how he first infiltrated and then transformed economics. Because looking back, I mean, you know, we see history as it unfolds, but it's really very unlikely, and Barbara can confirm or correct, but I think he himself said he didn't really expect his research in psychology to have the effect on economics. It did, at least at the start. And there were forerunners that didn't transform economics. The Allais paradox, the Ellsberg paradox, cognitive dissonance theory in psychology, all these things from the 50s did not have an impact on economics, which is a famously not very receptive field to outside influence. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts about why it happened, you know, beyond his work obviously being very good. Was there something about the timing, either intellectually in terms of the state of society in the late 70s, 80s, that made prospect theory this very influential research that in very short order had to be taken on board by economists? Thank you.
Why did his work fly when other work that preceded it didn't?
Fascinating.
While you're taking the mic further to the back,
Okay.
the short answer, I think, and you see it in his Nobel acceptance speech, is that they recognised they needed to change economists' mind to change policy. And of course, their key papers were published in econ journals, and not just the psych ones. I actually think psychologists, for what it's worth, could do it for themselves, if only they had more of a normative view of how the world ought to be, as well as simply describing the world. But he very much thought that you needed to change economics in order to change policy, and to have this sort of impact that he had that other psychologists didn't have because they were publishing only in psychology journals.
I think that's true. I think there was also that little thing called the Great Financial Crisis.
That was later.
Yeah, it was later, but when the Great Financial Crisis happened, you know, and a shell-shocked policymaking and financial industry was looking for what the hell do we do next, it became very fashionable to grab at behavioural economics and behavioural science in that way. So I think that gave more impetus to it.
It's something that I talked with my daughter in 2005 when she was on the first year of law. And she was fascinated by rational decisions theory. And I told her what I am trying to tell you now. We don't make decisions in our individual interest. Gillian will probably agree with me. We were making decisions within a tribe and what is best for the tribe, up to going out of the cave and starving yourself to death if you are not accepted. It's not so tragic now, but I think there should be research where the question is posed in a different way. What kind of interest had the person in mind while making a decision? Can we find a group which this person seems emotionally, historically, by her or his background aligned with, and for which group this decision would be actually one of the best outcomes? I don't think there is any research of this kind. Now, there is a second thing about the models. The best data for the best predictions for the last presidential election in the USA came from synthetic data, data created by artificial intelligence, specially designed for it, of course. Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing in response to Martin's question, which I think also the other reason why he flew was because it was also a reaction against the late 20th century and the explosion of computerization, which enabled a kind of quantitative-based approach to life to appear to dominate and to shape macroeconomics. Without the computer, there wouldn't have been an explosion in the obsession with quantitative tools. And I think in many ways he was a reaction against that quantitative tools couldn't be the only answer to everything.
Let's have some online questions. Maybe you could read out.
Do you want two or three?
And have a general answer onto them.
Okay. Violetta Shirakaya asks, you're all very academic and educated, but have you ever found yourself...
Maybe not the second, certainly the first anyway.
Wow. This will perhaps mean this question's good for you, because she asks if you've ever caught yourself falling prey to any cognitive bias. Damien Lamus asks if there's a way to bridge the gap between academic environments where the guessing it wrong principle is accepted and environments like business where guessing it wrong is rarely accepted. And Kirsty Hepburn asks, what's the biggest lesson you've learned from Danny?
Okay, oh great, okay, so quickly then. First of all, we all get it wrong all of the time. Education is absolutely no barrier or means against any of these biases. Danny was the first to admit that he would often succumb to most of them. If you can give people placebos and tell them that they're taking placebos and their pain is still going down as a result of it, we can be pretty influenced by most things that we think we could overcome as biases. Getting it wrong, I mean, it is interesting. I think that we need better repositories of things that we've messed up in both policy life and private companies. We're trying stuff all the time that we tried before that didn't work, but we don't have a historical record and memory when things went wrong. That's one thing that we could definitely do. And the lesson learned, I think Danny was a great storyteller, and I think he reminded us all that there's nothing more powerful than a really good story.
I'll say for myself, the time when I got life most wrong because of my biases was when I forgot all of my training as a cultural anthropologist and did the 101 mistake of projecting my assumptions on everybody else, and that was during Brexit, when, to me, living my privileged, globalized life, I assumed it was obvious that everyone else would think that Brexit was a bad idea and was genuinely shocked by the result. And that was a real slap in the face to me to get out of my bubble and to learn to listen and to try and see the world through other people's eyes and recognize just how easy it is to slip into our own little rabbit holes. And coming out of that, in link to that, is the biggest lesson that I personally learned from Daniel Kahneman was extreme curiosity and humility, and a desire to never stop asking why.
All right.
Oh.
Well, I actually think that is a perfect note on which to end. I mean, he was one of the most wonderful people that any of us four have known. We miss him. And I think that he would have loved this event, actually. This has been such
he would have also cracked a joke about it as well.
Very nice questions. And thank you all for coming, including you online. And we shall not forget him.
Thank you.